also those around him would look at him like he was crazy. He was really a sick bastard for whom killing people was fun, but he tried to hide it from those around him. Yong Min was very happy about this turn of events because now everyone, even those who were born with a golden spoon in their mouths and everyone else, would have an equal life. He envied those who were born to good parents and lived in wealth, but on the other hand, he felt that his life was unfair. But now it was possible not to cry about life not being fair. So, seeing the frightened faces of his friends, he firmly advised them to calm down. After all, they only need to survive now, so why are they so worried? One of them replied to him that it was unfair. After all, they didn't even have a chance to have fun, and now they would have to die. Yong Min still stood his ground as he felt they were not the only ones in this situation, and then what was unfair about it? Hearing his words, his friends fell silent and looked at him with anger and incomprehension. One of them answered him with a sigh that he was a bastard and with his miserable life, he wouldn't even be missed if he died right now. After all, he had tons of things he wanted to do. Yong Min didn't pay attention to their words, he was looking around in the crowd. They asked him what he was looking for. As it turned out, he was looking for his personal punching bag. He wondered where that little rascal had gone. He had definitely seen him heading in that direction before he passed out. Could it be that he couldn't even make it past the first round and died there? But still not finding him, he calmly shrugged his shoulders. It made sense to him that a loser like him didn't survive after all. Suddenly, something caught his attention. In the crowd, he saw a man in medieval armor. Yong Min couldn't understand who this guy was and where he managed to dig up this outdated armor. But then he realized it could only mean one thing: the status windows were working here as well. As soon as he gave the right command, his status window with his characteristics appeared in front of him. He couldn't believe that it had worked. Yong Min immediately shouted to his friends to all try to turn on their status windows because it worked here, too. They were once again shocked that it worked. Seeing their actions, the others also followed suit, but everyone was curious if this meant that they could use all of their stats and items here. To test this, Yong Min picked up a small pebble from the asphalt. He squeezed it in his hand, and it shattered into small pieces. The remnants of the stone turned into a saw blade that spilled out through his fingers. This meant that they could possess strength that surpassed that of mere mortals in the real world. Yong Min was thrilled with his abilities and exclaimed that it was amazing. A few hours later, the next breaking news was announced on the morning news nationwide. The anchorwoman said that an incredible event had occurred early this morning at the square in the Zhongro district where the New Year's welcoming ceremony was being held. Over 10,000 people passed out en masse. And then offered to watch a video to see what happened. The video contained an amazing scene. A winged woman appeared in the sky, emitting a bright light. People were stunned by the appearance of a woman who looked like an angel. She moved her lips as if she were saying something, but nothing could be heard. Soon after, a young man asked the angel a question, and his head exploded like fireworks. After that, people started scattering in panic. Then the woman held out her hands to them and said something. And then people started to faint. About 10,000 people fell asleep at once. The people in the video fell unconscious, like puppets without a puppeteer. The video ended with the police investigating the incidents and already reporting that the victims were young men between the ages of 15 and 29. It has also been confirmed that similar incidents have happened in different countries around the world. Users of one of the social networks reacted very strongly to it all, and almost everyone thought it was a fake and a joke. Many people couldn't believe the obituaries, which seemed a bit ridiculous, but there were also many who believed them without a doubt. Ryu Min walked down the street and read the news on his smartphone and knew for sure that this was all just the beginning. News appeared one after another that said that about half of the civilians who had passed out had regained consciousness, while the other half remained comatose at the scene and were diagnosed with brain die-off. Also, some celebrity was found dead in that square. This was the first time that more than 11% of the country's population died in one incident. The news came out one after another without stopping. But these were just consequences that could no longer be dealt with. The real problem was somewhere else, and no one on the news was talking about it. Ryu Min passed by the screen that said that the survivors were now calling themselves players, and the reason behind it was still under investigation by the police. Ryu Min knew that the problem for this world would be the fact that the players' abilities had been transferred to reality. As long as there wasn't a person with high characteristics, this problem wasn't very noticeable. But once the level of the players increases, they will become transcendent entities. When this happens, some players who lack self-awareness will begin to display their power like lawless criminals. This would lead to the creation of weapons that even the military and the latest weapons could not control. Ryu Min was not going to sit back and just watch the world meet chaotic events. If he had just left things as they were, the Earth would probably have fallen into ruins even before the 20th round arrived. There is only one solution: he will have to control the other players using overwhelming force. Intoxicated by their new powers, the players will bow down like beasts only to a superior force. In the past, he would just destroy everyone. But he couldn't do the same as last time, and now he would be forced to use a different method to gather a team of 5 players to battle the boss. He even had a few people with potential in mind and was now thinking of methods to recruit them. But the time to act was not yet upon him, and he had more important things to do than that. So he reached his house and knocked on the door. It was an apartment building in one of Seoul's neighborhoods. But no one answered or opened the door, so he had to get the key out of his hiding place and open the door himself. It was semi-dark inside. However, one detail caught his eye. Ryu Min was unhappy that the bastard had eaten a bowl of ramen for dinner again instead of cooking a proper dinner. But he had seen this hundreds of times before and had put up with it. He went further into the house and opened the door to the room. There was his little brother sleeping peacefully and carefree on the floor. He had no one else in his family besides him, and he was his only family. He was very similar to his older brother. Ryu Min looked at his sleeping brother and was glad that he could sleep soundly even if his older brother didn't come home. His name was Ryu One, and he was in his 3rd year of middle school. Their family had once been quite ordinary and happy, but after their parents died in a car accident, a lot of things changed quickly for them. And one of the most drastic changes that happened was that he became one's sole protector. Min saw a band-aid coming off his brother's fist. He glued it back on and stared at him. From the touch, the stare, and the lights on in the room, Ryu One finally woke up. His brother told him it was time to wake up, but One was in no hurry to get out of bed. Min said it was morning, and it was time to get up. But he didn't agree with him because it was only 6 a.m. and he was in no hurry to get up. Min realized that this would not do and moved to more active actions and sharply pulled the blanket off his brother. Then he explained that they didn't have time to get any sleep and that he would explain everything to him later. For now, he should have dressed quickly for the walk. One took his time and didn't realize what was going on. He yawned and asked where they were going, at least. If he suddenly felt like going to see the sunrise, he would rather get more sleep. However, when he saw his brother's serious face, he tensed up a little. His brother told him to obey. After all, this was not the time to relax and sleep, the whole world was in chaos. One asked his brother if there was anything wrong with the New Year ceremony he was going to attend. But he hurried him to get out of the house first, and then he would tell him everything when they went. They left the house and walked down the narrow street where the cold morning air was keeping one awake. He walked beside his brother and looked at his brother's grim face. Something was definitely wrong. One had never seen this side of his brother before. However, he didn't dare to ask him anything. He thought his brother would explain everything himself, but he was strangely different from his old self. He was an entirely different man. And his serious look told him that something terrible had happened. Ryu Min asked his brother if he really didn't know what was happening in the world right now. He looked at him with an incomprehensible look. He asked why he was saying such scary things to him. What could have happened while he was sleeping? Min advised him to check the latest news in the search feed. One took out his smartphone and started scrolling the feed quickly. He didn't understand what had happened and what it all meant. What kind of angel appeared and kidnapped civilians to another world? Min corrected him that, to be more precise, only their souls were taken. One said with surprise that it couldn't be, and he was taken away too. His brother told him that he had been taken too. He could only get out after killing 100 monsters called goblins. One immediately began to worry about his brother's health and asked if he was hurt. He advised him not to worry about him. But one couldn't accept this and resented how he could not worry about his brother. After all, he was his only family, his only sibling, and dearest person. The one who comforted and supported him always. Though he was too shy to say it out loud, he had always respected his brother and relied on him as a father figure. One, of course, knew that in order to fill the hole that mom and dad left behind, it wasn't enough to just be there for him. Min had to become the strongest mental individual he had, without a doubt, become. But having a strong mind and killing 100 monsters were completely different things. His brother also had a weakness. Although he recognized that his brother had strong mental strength, it didn't mean that he was good at fighting. Moreover, he was small in stature and had been beaten up himself before. His musings were interrupted by his brother's voice, telling him that he knew what he was thinking. And reassured him that in that other world, there was a system called stats that controlled the level of physical development. Even girls can fight goblins as equals. So he shouldn't worry about him. And even more so, when he sees him later, he definitely won't think like he does now. One asked what he meant by that. But his brother answered him that if he wanted to know, then let him just follow him. But one stopped and said he didn't want to until he told him where they were going, he wouldn't take a step. He asked for the man to tell him first. And he put his hand with the wound on his chest. On which Ryu Min's gaze lingered. He had already experienced this kind of reaction in a previous regression. Ryu Min turned to Ryu 1 and told him in a cold voice that they were going to attack the hideout of Teju, who was the leader of the bullies in his class. He added that he knew that a guy named Teju had recently been bullied him at school. Ryu 1 was shocked. He didn't want to burden his older brother, who was already working hard to feed them both. However, somehow, Ryu Min had found out. Still not believing that his brother had found out, Ryu 1 asked his brother if he really knew about it. Ryu 1 asked back, did he really think he wouldn't find out? Ryu 1 bit his lip. He thought he had hidden it well, but it turned out that his brother had known about the bullying all along. Looking at his slumped brother who didn't want to get him in trouble, Ryu Min apologized to himself in front of him and said to himself that he shouldn't have known that. This happened during the first regression. It wasn't until a few hours after returning from the first round that Ryu Min learned the truth about the bullying his brother had endured. One very ordinary sunny morning while he was sleeping. His brother dressed in his dress clothes and said he'd be back soon, and left. After a while, Ryu Min was awakened by the ringing of the phone. Annoyed at who might be calling him, he reached for the phone. Still sleepy, he asked who was calling. To which the voice immediately asked if he was the guardian of someone like Ryu 1. Then it immediately added that he should come to the hospital immediately. After saying that, the protagonist's pupils dilated in horror. The next second, he quickly got dressed and ran out of the apartment. After beating Teju, Ryu 1 became blind. Looking at his younger brother, who was sitting on the futon with his arms wrapped around his knees, depressed, Ryu Min was shocked and angry that he couldn't protect him. He felt guilty for letting his own weakness burden Ryu 1. But he knew he had to do something. After all, Ryu 1 was his only family. After looking at his brother, he decided that he couldn't just let someone who bullied him get away with it anymore. He wanted to make sure that Ryu 1 would never be bullied again, and that meant putting Teju in his place. Words of cursing, insults, and taking had been going around the factory since early morning. In addition, the sounds of blows could be heard, echoing loudly throughout the building. Someone's massive foot once again kicked some guy in the chest, causing him to let out a painful groan. It was none other than Teju, who was standing in front of the students he had beaten up, furiously asking why they hadn't brought him 200,000 won each as he had ordered them to. Shivering in pain and agony, he tried to say something, but only managed to squeeze out another painful groan. Teju took that as ignoring him. which made him even angrier. He lifted his foot and swung it at the poor guy with anger in his eyes. Then he began to beat the poor guy again with anger, who had no chance to resist, and it would have made things worse, because his assailant was not alone. Tejiu's friends stood aside, watching this one-sided beating with a chuckle. But they were actually tense and afraid of Tejiu's ruthless attitude. Since he was very unpredictable and very cruel. Even the other high school students were afraid of him. Tejiu was 185 centimeters tall, and he had a rather large physique for a sophomore high school student. Undoubtedly, he was an overwhelming dominant among his peers and was famous even among gangsters for his fighting skills. After a while, the man was finally done with the beating. Screaming harshly, he scratched his neck and headed towards his buddies, complaining irritably that he couldn't buy a motorcycle today, as he couldn't get the money he was going to get today. Seeing the angry guy approaching them, the group of his buddies immediately tensed up. And unfortunately for them, their fears were realized as Tejiu approached his gang and asked if any of them had any money. The gang was caught off guard, and each of them scratched the back of their heads nervously. Realizing that he couldn't get anything out of them, he asked his buddies where he could get some money right now. They rubbed their chins and thought about it like it was their own problem. If they couldn't figure out a way to get him some money, they would be in a tight spot again. After some pondering, one of the gang members had an epiphany. Then, with a smile on his face, he turned to Tejiu and asked why they shouldn't call that tall guy with curly hair who was from their class. Tejiu's lips curled into an evil grin when he realized who he was talking about. Then he added that he planned to call him today anyway, since he thought he deserved a good beating as a New Year's present. While the happy bandits, who were lucky enough not to be robbed of their money by their leader, were discussing how they would teach Ryu-1 a lesson today with smiles on their faces. Tejiu turned to them and said that the guy they were planning to beat up was very poor. The gang members were puzzled when they heard that. Tejiu smirked and added that he had never been able to bring money even after he had beaten him up once. And his house also looked old and shabby. Then he also told the confused boys that he also had no parents. And that he only lived with one brother. Suddenly some noise came from the other end of the factory. All the hooligans stopped to listen. Top, stomp. Footsteps were being heard in the quiet abandoned factory. Not one, but at least two pairs of footsteps. Pretty soon, two people appeared in front of the bullies. As it turned out, it was Ryu-Min who confidently entered the building while Ryu-1 hesitantly followed behind him. Tejiu's surprise was hard to describe in words, as he couldn't have expected his victim to come to him. With a gloating smirk, he turned to his curly-haired, insecure classmate and asked if he thought that bringing his friend along would make a difference. He shouted at Ryu-1 in a furious voice, hurling insults at him. This behavior of his Tejiu frightened the guy, causing him to start mumbling apologies, as well as grabbing the edge of his nonchalant brother's clothes. While Tejiu was somewhat satisfied with Ryu-1's reaction, he couldn't help but feel a bit unsatisfied. The expression on the other's face did not change. Unable to bear being ignored any longer, he asked Ryu-1 in an irritated voice who he had brought along with him. Before he could say anything, Ryu-Min stepped forward with a smile on his face and confidently stated that he was his older brother. Tejiu laughed, then turned to Ryu-1, who was standing behind his older brother, and reminded him that he had already told him to watch his language if he didn't want to get beaten up. And now he had come with his older brother to his hideout to get revenge. With a mocking smirk on his face, Tejiu kneaded his fists and told Ryu-1 that he and his brother would die today. Then turning to one of his minions, he nodded and ordered them to act. The latter, not realizing what he was getting into, nodded in agreement with a happy smile. Leaving their leader standing behind and watching, the gang of hooligans of three headed straight for the two brothers. As they warmed up, the bandits marveled that someone had dared to challenge Tejiu himself. The guy who went first turned to Ryu-1 and asked him if his brother had fought well. He then approached Ryu-Min, who was looking at him with a nonchalant gaze and mocked his height, and asked him if he was ready to start. But all he got in response to his question was a fist that hit him in the face with great force. With a painful cry, he fell backwards and fell on his back, right in front of his friend, who had not expected such a turn of events. When he saw his friend's defeat, he immediately rushed at the protagonist, intending to strike him with his fist. However, Ryu Min was unable to dodge the blow, as he was able to take a step backwards. Taking advantage of the fact that the opponent was open to attack, the protagonist struck him in the jaw with his fist. The blow was so strong that the bandit let out a painful scream and flew a few meters away, hitting some debris behind him. At the same time, the bandit who had already recovered from the blow, as well as the remaining bald guy who was shouting angrily for him to die, rushed at Ryu Min again. However, this joint attack was of no use at all, as all they got was 2 blows to their faces. At the same time, Tejiu was watching his buddies being beaten up and crawling on the floor with painful groans. Chuckled with a contemptuous smile on his face. Calling them trash to himself, he realized that those guys were no match for Ryu Min. With the anticipation of a good fight, he wondered how well such a small and lanky man could fight, but now he had an answer. There was nothing special about it, although his boxing skills seemed pretty decent. To Tejiu, who had experience in the sport, there was nothing special about it. As he walked past the fallen members of his clown team, he turned to Ryu Min, noting that he seemed to have learned boxing from somewhere, and that he thought he could do something about it. Tejiu mockingly said that he didn't take into account one thing, and that was how big the difference in weight was between the two of them. Tejiu was 185 centimeters tall and had a sturdy build, while Ryu Min was 165 centimeters tall and looked frail. The difference in weight classes was obvious, and one could easily predict the outcome of the fight between the two without even watching it. However, to the bandit's surprise, Ryu Min didn't look scared at all. With a smile on his face, he turned to the big man and asked him if he was watching the news. Irritated, he looked at the protagonist and asked what he was talking about. Ryu Min clucked, while Tejiu's forehead veins swelled up. Unable to bear it any longer, the big guy lunged at the protagonist, shouting curses at him. But to his surprise, he easily dodged with a quick turn of his head. Most people would have been stunned and staggered by such a blow, but Ryu Min managed to avoid it effortlessly. Tejiu continued to throw punches with his arms and legs, trying to hit Ryu Min, but to no avail. He had hoped to gain an advantage in the fight by making the first move, but things didn't go as planned, as the guy in front of him was somehow miraculously able to easily dodge all of his attacks. At some point, Tejiu felt tired as a result of his active actions. Once again, he looked at the guy in front of him, who seemed blurry due to his fatigue. He gritted his teeth in anger and wondered why he hadn't been able to land a blow. At the same time, Ryu Min's fist lit up with a blue aura. Then, he turned to Tejiu and said that if he had been watching the news, he would have known that attacking a player like him so easily was tantamount to suicide. The next moment, he threw a lightning-fast punch that hit the bandit's jaw. Surprisingly, a moment later, Tejiu rushed to attack the protagonist with a fierce shout of curses. But to his surprise and confusion, his blow did not hit the target, as his opponent simply disappeared. Unable to believe what was happening, he tried to turn around with horror on his face. However, he was immediately overtaken by Ryu Min's fist, which forcefully struck him again. With a painful groan as he rubbed his nose, Tejiu, who had already been numbed by several blows, managed to stand on his feet again, and in an angry and teared voice told the protagonist that he would kill him. As it turned out, however, the nose wasn't the only problem. On Tejiu's hand was one of his teeth, which he stared at with horror, still unable to fully realize what had happened to him. But after a few seconds, in a voice that was now filled with killing intent, Tejiu shouted in a very loud and furious voice that he would kill Ryu Min. With deadly force, he swung his fist, but the blow missed its target. After dodging the attack and intercepting the big guy's arm, the protagonist immediately used his free hand to land several blows on his head. Ryu Min's movements were so clean and efficient that it seemed like his previous demonstration of skill was just a fake. Tejiu's cronies, having come to their senses, watched in surprise and confusion as their ringleader was humiliated. Once again receiving several blows to the face, he turned around and looked at Ryu Min angrily, wondering how long he was going to aim for his face. However, he realized that in order to win, he only needed to land one blow, after which he would have a good chance of winning. With firm determination, he once again lunged at the guy in front of him, who nonchalantly continued to stand still. Gritting his teeth, he tried to land the blow that was his only chance of victory. But there was no miracle, and the next moment Ryu Min's foot appeared in front of his face, which kicked him in the face and threw him back against the wall he had hit. The main character called Tejiu's name and looked at him with an icy stare as he stood on all fours, breathing heavily and moaning painfully. And looked at him with a chilling gaze, he asked in a cold voice if he was in pain. What he saw on that fateful day was forever imprinted in his memory, and was something he would not be able to forget even after hundreds of regressions. That was why, as he looked at Tejiu, who now looked like a pig begging for mercy, he decided that if he didn't want a repeat of that hell, he had to do everything he could to make sure it didn't happen. Tejiu's vision blurred for a moment as he saw Ryu Min's fist approaching him again. As much as he didn't want to admit it, attacking alone wouldn't solve anything. He instinctively raised his hand to block the blow, but to his surprise Ryu Min simply took his hand in his own. With a villainous smile on his face, he looked at the bandit and told him in a cold voice that he shouldn't have messed with his little brother. The next moment, the sound of bones breaking was heard. Tejiu's face showed a look of confusion and bewilderment. But the next moment, he cried out in pain while looking at his fingers, which were twisted in different directions. Not paying attention to the bandit's cries, Ryu Min immediately grabbed his other hand, the fingers of which were still in a normal state that needed to be fixed immediately. Feeling the guy's grip on his hand, and realizing what was about to happen, Tejiu's eyes filled with a horror and despair that he had never experienced before in his life. The next moment, another heartbreaking scream was heard, accompanied by the crunch of bones breaking. At the same time, the gang members who were watching from the sidelines started to run away in a panic, realizing that if they didn't do it now, they might suffer the same fate. For Ryu 1, hearing and watching this was too much for him, so he turned away. Standing over Tejiu, who was sitting on the floor with tears in his eyes, moaning painfully, Ryu Min coldly asked him if he knew what would happen then. The bandit, in tears and trembling from the pain, immediately stammered that he knew, then promised that he wouldn't touch him again. Smiling, the protagonist replied that it was the right decision. But the next moment, he grabbed Tejiu's hand and added that he needed to make sure that Tejiu didn't change his mind. The bandit's eyes, which had calmed down a bit, became terrified again. He tearfully begged the guy not to do it. But a moment later, Tejiu's heartrending scream echoed through the abandoned factory, followed by a voice that promised that if he wanted revenge or to report him to the police, he would find him wherever he was hiding. At that moment a deep-seated fear took hold of the bandit's mind for the first time in his life. Walking down the night street, illuminated by the light of lanterns, Ryu 1 couldn't stay in the dark any longer. In a hesitant voice, he turned to his older brother who was walking in front of him, asking him where he had learned martial arts. However, this was impossible, as Ryu Min had been working part-time to earn a living since he became a high school student. Turning to his younger brother, he replied that just like the news said, players could use their abilities in the real world. As an example, he pointed to his hand, which shone with a bright golden light. In the next moment, a black dagger appeared in his hand, causing Ryu 1 to gasp in surprise. Shining with excitement, he pointed his hand at the dagger and asked Ryu Min in surprise how it could appear out of thin air. With a grin, he replied that it was called an in-game inventory that could be used to summon weapons and other useful items. While Ryu Min was putting the dagger back into his inventory, Ryu 1 remembered what had happened at the factory and asked in the same surprised voice if his quick movements were also from the game. Ryu 1 replied that it was, adding that it was because his dexterity stat reached level 11. Then when his younger brother asked him if he was talking about stats from the game, he answered in the affirmative, saying that normal people's agility stats were around 3 points, while professional athletes could reach 10 points. Ryu 1 followed his brother and asked what would happen if his level increased. And he replied that he didn't know because he had never had it before. He added to himself that it was about this life, of course. He didn't plan on revealing that he was a regressor, since he had already done so. The first time had been when one had been kidnapped by a player. Even though he was able to get revenge, he didn't want to feel those emotions again, much less have his younger brother suffer for it. Turning to look at Ryu 1, who was following him, he told himself that he had to prepare himself to protect him in the upcoming fight between the players. After asking one if he was hungry, he offered him breakfast at a diner. Hearing this, he nodded happily with shining eyes. After they entered the nearest store, Ryu Min immediately headed towards the ATM. When Ryu Won saw this, he asked where he was going, saying that the noodles were in a different place. Ryu Min turned around and told him to wait for a few minutes. He went to the ATM and inserted his card. He looked at the screen and thought to himself that this was all he could save up to that point. His balance was 133,200 won. After selecting a transaction amount of 100,000 won, he pressed the button to confirm the transaction. Seeing the huge bills in his older brother's hands, Ryu Won was surprised to see why he needed so much money, to which the protagonist replied that he needed it for something. When Ryu Min approached the noodle shop, he asked his younger brother what he wanted to choose today. Hearing his older brother's words, he was confused. Then he said in an uncertain voice that this place was selling quite expensive noodles. But Ryu Min replied that it was fine, and they could afford to choose something here today. Then with a smile on his face, he asked if he was going to eat cheap noodles for the new year. Ryu Won replied that he wouldn't want to, but then they might not have enough money for food in the future. The protagonist replied that today he didn't have to worry about that and could choose what he wanted. At a young age, he had never dined out like everyone else. Of course, he wanted to try it too. Trusting his older brother's words, Ryu Won excitedly grabbed a chili pork belly from the counter and said in a joyful voice that he would have it. Watching his brother being happy even for such a small thing, Ryu Min couldn't help but be happy for him. Ryu Min approached Ryu Won, who was shining with happiness, and suggested that they go to a restaurant together sometime and order some roast beef. But Ryu Won smiled the happiest smile Ryu Min had ever seen and replied that there was no need, as he had more than enough of what they had bought today. Seeing how happy his brother was, the protagonist told him to wait for only 5 days, after which he could eat as much meat as he wanted. Ryu Won took a piece of meat with his chopsticks and put it on a spoonful of rice. Ryu Won, shining with happiness and anticipation, put the spoon into his mouth. After chewing it, he happily said with a happy face that it was delicious. Seeing that his brother was happy, Ryu Min couldn't help but smile, then told him to eat some more. Seeing his brother suddenly get up from the table, Ryu Won excitedly asked where he was going, to which the protagonist told him to wait for him. When he returned, Ryu Min loudly slammed his hand on the table, placing his pen on it. Confused, Ryu Won looked at the sheets of paper his older brother had brought with him and asked in an uncertain voice if he had spent all the money on the lottery. Ryu Won replied with a pen in his hand that he had. Not understanding why his older brother had done that, Ryu Won excitedly asked him how many tickets he had bought. And he replied in the same relaxed voice that there were 20 tickets. Hearing this, Ryu Won panicked and asked Ryu Min in an agitated voice how Ryu Min could have spent almost all of their money buying lottery tickets, since he himself should know that it was almost impossible to win them. However, his older brother calmly told him to trust him and just watch. Then he took a pen and began to color in the numbers on the lottery tickets. Ryu Won was puzzled when he saw the numbers his brother had painted over. He asked why he had painted over the numbers on all the tickets in the same places. The main character turned around and with a smile on his face replied that he did it because those numbers were the winning ones. The brothers were sitting at the table in their home. There were lottery tickets on the table. Min was calmly flipping through his phone. His brother nervously held the phone in one hand and propped his head up with the other. The announcement of the lottery draw was made from his phone. One was biting his fingernails with worry. He was staring at the screen of his phone with the live broadcast. He thought they were in trouble because they had wasted 100 million won. When the auction started, he said that they would have been better off buying better food with that much money. He was in a depressed state. His older brother simply told him to stop biting his nails. The hosts announced that the first lucky number was 3. One stopped biting his nails. The second lucky number, to his pleasant surprise, was 9. The third number was also on their ticket. It was the number 38. The younger brother listened as if in a dream as the other numbers from the winning combination were announced. He came to when the camera broadcasting the program focused on the balls with the numbers that fell out of the lottery machine. Distrusting his eyes, he checked the numbers on the ticket and on the screen. They all matched. He was overwhelmed with emotion. He looked from the phone to the ticket and back again. With happiness, he shouted that it was unreal that they had won first place. With his eyes full of tears of happiness, he asked to pinch his cheek to make him believe in the reality of what was happening. Min awkwardly told him to pinch himself. He looked at his younger brother with understanding when he asked again if he was dreaming. The hosts repeated the same numbers again. With a smile, he asked if he would prefer it to be a dream. One spelled it out, no, never. Finally believing that they had won a lot of money, he rose to his feet and shouted his delight that they had won first place. He held the ticket in his hands, high above his head. His older brother had to ask him to be quiet. He quieted down when they explained that the neighbors could hear them. Min asked him if he was really that excited about their win. His younger brother answered in the affirmative and asked if he was happy as well. One didn't let go of the ticket. The older brother replied that of course he was happy. He thought about the first time they won. That time he had also shouted with joy. Back then, he and his brother were equally happy and looked at the ticket and the phone screen in the same way. But after repeating this process dozens of times, it turned into an annual event. He did it out of necessity and no longer enjoyed it. It was a duty to get rich quick after each regression. The death of 900 million people will shake the economy. So the trade in valuable game items that would begin later would be conducted with cash. One got his hands on all the tickets. He said he couldn't believe they had 100 prizes for the first place. I wonder how much money they will get. His brother replied that he didn't know. He thought it was a huge jackpot. So big that it could shake the world. Ryu Min got off the bus and walked down the street. He soon saw a tall building in front of him. It was the main branch of Non-Hep Bank, where he was to receive his prize. Normally he would have been nervous before entering, but maybe it's because this is the 100th time I'm receiving the grand prize, but I'm not nervous at all, Ryu Min thought to himself. The bank was crowded with customers, but none of them were lottery winners. Ryu Min went to the front desk in the lobby of the new building, and then approached the employee on duty, telling him for about the 100th time that he had won the lottery. Hearing the words of the protagonist, he smiled and congratulated him on his winnings. At the same time, he wondered to himself how the guy standing in front of him, who looked like a student, was able to get the prize for the first place. Pushing his thoughts away and searching for something on the computer, he asked Ryu Min where he had purchased his ticket, to which he replied that it was at the Yonghui branch. Hearing the guy's words, the employee exclaimed in shock, unable to believe what he had said. His mind immediately went back to a conversation with his colleague, who told him that this time 115 tickets had been won, which surprised him a lot, as it was a very large number. However, his colleague told him that it was as shocking as the fact that 100 of them came from the same place. After these words, the first employee's eyes widened with surprise, because this could only mean one thing, that one person had bought all these tickets. But it was not as shocking as the fact that he took a risk and bet all 100 tickets on one combination of numbers. As he was leaving, his colleague also told him to call the president of the bank immediately if anyone said they bought a ticket at the Yonghui branch, as that person was supposed to be a VIP guest. The employee's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Ryu Min, who, seeing something frozen with surprise, decided to ask if he was all right. After he came to his senses and apologized, he asked the protagonist to wait for a while. Seeing no reason to refuse, the latter agreed. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man appeared in front of Ryu Min, who smiled and thanked him for waiting. After shaking hands with the protagonist, he introduced himself as Guan Juno, saying that he was the president of the bank. The protagonist simply replied that his name was Ryu Min. The president said that since he had won the first-place prize, he had to congratulate him personally. Ryu Min smilingly thanked the man for congratulating him. Afterwards, the man offered to escort him to the place where he could collect his winnings, telling him to follow him. As they approached the door with a sign that read "Lottery Ticket Sales Team," the president announced that they had arrived at the place. As soon as they stepped inside, they were immediately greeted by one of the female employees who stood up and bowed to greet the president. Noticing some young man next to the president, she couldn't help but wonder who it could be. But she didn't have to speculate, because the next moment the president himself introduced the guy, saying that he was the first place winner and that he had come to collect his prize. Then he told them to make sure that their guest felt comfortable. Surprised to see the guy who was talking casually with the president, the woman could hardly believe that in front of her was a man who had won 100 tickets. Having recovered from her excitement and doubts, she told herself that she should calm down, and do her best to satisfy the customer. After greeting him, she invited Ryu Min to sit down with a smile on her face. He did so, sitting comfortably on the chair right in front of her. She then asked him if he would like a drink. The protagonist replied that he would not, adding that he would like to get right down to business and take his prize. After hearing the guy's answer, the employee didn't take any more time and asked him to provide her with the tickets so she could confirm that he was the winner. Ryu Min immediately handed her a stack of winning tickets that he had brought with him. Looking through the tickets, the woman couldn't believe that he had bet everything on one combination. It could only mean one thing: either the guy had decided to risk everything or he could see the future. Having finished with the confirmation, the employee said that everything was in order and that he could take the prize for the first place. However, the protagonist's next question about how much he would receive made the girl freeze, as even just naming such numbers was exciting. After a second of silence, she replied in an excited voice that his prize is 22.5 billion won. Ryu Min was left with about 15 billion won after the tax was deducted from it. After he received his prize, everything went pretty quickly. The first thing he did was start looking for a place to move to. That same night, he opened a promotional account. Because he had information from the future, he knew that the price of Bitcoin would increase by 500% next month, so he also planned to invest his money in it. After returning home, Ryu Min showed his younger brother pictures of their new house and asked him if he liked it. Ryu Won happily replied that it was amazing, adding that he had never seen such a huge and beautiful house in person, except in pictures. The main character replied that it was the best place they could move into immediately. Ryu Won turned to his older brother and asked him why they shouldn't just buy a house since they had so much money. Ryu Min replied that he didn't have any more money. His phrase made one freeze in place. The protagonist casually added that he had invested all 14 billion won in Bitcoin. When his younger brother heard this, he froze in place again, unable to understand how his brother could so easily say that he had invested 14 billion won in Bitcoin. Ryu Min approached his younger brother, who had turned into a statue, and patted him on the shoulder, assuring him that he hadn't done it without thinking. Then hugging Won, he added that this time he would definitely be able to make money, since he had seen 4 sets of numbers in his dreams in the lottery. After his older brother's words, the eyes of the naive Ryu Won shone with admiration, as he had only heard of people seeing the lottery numbers in their dreams. Realizing this, he immediately grabbed Ryu Min by the shoulders and began to shake him, excitedly asking him if he remembered the numbers, adding that he should never forget them. The protagonist broke free from his little brother's grip, thinking to himself that he couldn't forget them if he'd done it countless times. Ryu Min turned to his brother and suggested that he eat outside before heading out. One asked in confusion where they were going. The protagonist replied with a smile on his face that they were moving today. At the same time, at some unknown location, an equally unknown man slammed his fist against a concrete wall. The unknown man was a rather young guy who, for unknown reasons and against common sense, hit the wall with his fist, leaving a rather large dent. Such destructive power obviously could not belong to an ordinary person. This guy was Young Min, who looked at his fist, which remained unharmed even after such a blow, with a villainous smile, and said to himself that pumping all the points to strength was the right decision. Swinging his fist at the innocent wall again, he added to himself that he was even able to get a power rune that doubled his strength. As he continued to strike the wall, he thought to himself that he was really lucky to get this rune out of all the runes. As he left his mark on history, he grinned wickedly at the result of his actions and mockingly told himself that even Tyson would be jealous when he saw such a powerful punch. Then, clenching his hand into a fist and grinning evilly, he told himself that this was enough for the test, and now he needed to try this power in real combat. The same man who was beating on the wall before, approached the house where Ryu Min lived and started knocking on the door, asking if he was home. When he didn't get an answer, the guy gave up wondering what could have happened to him since he didn't answer when his name was called. Remembering what happened that day, his eyes filled with anger. Remembering the guy's face, he couldn't help but curse him, adding in a cold voice that he wouldn't let him go so easily now. His eyes filled with hatred and rage, he couldn't forgive the guy for the way he looked at him that day. Gritting his teeth, he promised he would kill him for it. Starting to pound on the door with renewed vigor, he said with envy in his eyes that even if they were both players, the loser is still a loser, that's why he should teach him a lesson, to make him remember his place forever. Stopping knocking so hard, he told himself that it was obvious that the one was hiding inside his house, wondering why then the one was not coming out. Having stopped knocking, he leaned against the door with a sly smile and listening, he said in a loud voice that it looked like he wasn't home. Adding that he had no choice but to leave. Continuing to stand at the door, he angrily told himself that he must be huddled in a corner not even breathing to keep from opening it. This made him so angry that he made the decision to break down the door. However, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice calling him a student. Turning around, he saw an old man standing on the stairs, who turned to him and asked him what he was doing at that door. He asked the old man why he should care and then asked him if he was the owner of the house. Hearing the guy's question, the old man, adjusting his glasses, replied that he was the owner of the house. Then he asked the guy again if he had come to meet a friend. For a second he froze, not knowing what to say. He quickly adjusted himself to the situation and smiled and said that he had indeed come to see his friend. Then he asked the old man if he could open the door for him. He added that he had suddenly lost contact with his friend and now he didn't know how to get in touch with him. Hearing this, the old man was shocked. Then he told the guy that it was now an empty apartment, as the student who lived there had moved out. Hearing this, the guy immediately asked the owner of the house if he knew when and where the student had moved to. He replied that he had moved today, but he didn't know where he had moved to. Hearing the old man's answer, the guy was furious, and he clenched his fists in anger, wondering how he could have left without telling anyone. Arriving at the huge glass building, which was the size of a skyscraper, one exclaimed in surprise and admiration. Covering his eyes with his hand to keep the sun from shining, he said with shining eyes and amazement that the building was very tall. He was so innocent that he was even surprised that the door at the entrance was revolving. He didn't stop being amazed even when the female employee simply handed them entrance cards. While his older brother confirmed their identities, one continued to be surprised that there was even a security guard here. Pushing himself up in the elevator to his room, he turned to Min and said admiringly that this place was really amazing. Stepping out of the elevator, they headed to their room. When they got to their suite, one exclaimed again in surprise, wondering how big it was. His brother replied with a nonchalant face that it was about 330 square meters. Such a figure shocked his younger brother, as their previous apartment was dozens of times smaller. Looking at the apartment, Ryu 1, still in disbelief that they were going to live here, asked if it was for the two of them. He replied that they had a lot of money, and that the place they were going to live in should be at least this size. One asked Ryu Min how much the rent had cost him. One asked Ryu Min how much it had cost him to rent the place, and he said that it had cost about 22 million a month. The rent alone made his younger brother's head spin. He thought to himself that not so long ago he was still concerned about the price of meat, which at that time seemed very expensive to him. Following his older brother, who was still looking at the apartment they would be living in, one asked him if they could choose something cheaper. He shook his head negatively and replied that the more expensive the services were, the higher the security, which was their priority. After all, on the first of every month, all players fall under narcolepsy, and it was the period that was the most vulnerable for all players. During this time, they become vulnerable to disasters such as fire or earthquakes, but the biggest danger was not the cataclysms, but the assassins hired by other players. And so, when the time came, players would need to prepare to have their bodies in as protected a place as possible when moving to another world. It didn't matter how strong and extraordinary you could be in the other world, since it all ended if a person died in the real world. After finishing his thoughts, Ryu Min turned to his brother, who had already settled in a bit, and asked if he liked the house. Ryu Won enthusiastically replied that it was beautiful, and then asked why he was asking. The protagonist smilingly replied that he just wanted to make sure he liked it. Suddenly, Won's face became a little sad. He then apologized to his older brother in an uncertain and worried voice. Ryu Min looked at him in confusion, not understanding what he was apologizing for. Ryu Won continued in an upset voice, saying that since he would be transferred to another world next month, he would stay here and enjoy it alone. But this sad atmosphere was broken by Ryu Min, who patted his brother on the shoulder. Asking Won why he was so sad, he added that he didn't believe that he would return for the next tour, to which he replied in a more confident voice that he did. After rising to his feet, the protagonist told his younger brother to stop thinking about nonsense and follow him, as he had heard that the Korean hall on the second floor was serving very good food. To which he also went up and nodded affirmatively. Suddenly, a message arrived on Ryu Min's phone. After reading the message, he realized that the person knew that he had moved, but he continued to ignore him as he had no desire to meet him in real life again. Putting his phone in his coat pocket, he thoughtfully decided that he would probably make it another world. The day after the move, a sleepy Ryu Min came out of the bedroom. Was surprised to see Won, who was dressed in street clothes, going somewhere. When he asked him where he was going, Won happily replied that he had ordered some rice cakes and was going to pick them up. Still sleepy Min didn't immediately realize what he was talking about. As far as he could remember, this had never happened before. Although regression did not guarantee that everything would happen exactly the same way as in the past, it was a significant change. Turning to his younger brother, who had already packed up and intended to go, the protagonist asked him why he had decided to buy them. To which the latter replied that he was going to give them away to the neighbors, as a gift to celebrate their moving in, as he thought it would be good manners. Min thoughtfully replied that being on good terms with the neighbors was a great idea. Pleased at his older brother's praise, Won said that he could distribute them himself, adding that the latter could stay here and rest. However, the latter disagreed, replying that they should distribute the gifts together. He then told him to wait for a while he went to change his clothes. After a while they rang the bell of the first apartment, from which a voice came out seconds later, asking who it was. Ryu Won, with a smile on his face and a cake in his hands, good-naturedly informed them that they were their neighbors who had just moved in, and now came to greet them. Opening the door, a middle-aged woman with a smile also greeted them. Then noticing that the two looked very similar, she asked if they were twins. To which one smilingly replied that they were. Handing the woman a rice cake, he advised her to eat them while they were still warm. After the woman took the gift, they said goodbye. Then after some more time, they continued to greet their neighbors, continuing to give them gifts. Almost done with greeting the neighbors, and heading to the last place by elevator, one said in a tired voice that he didn't expect gift-giving to be so tiring. Min cheered him up by saying that as soon as they were done, they would go home to rest. Walking down the corridor, the protagonist turned to his younger brother and asked him if he knew that the floor they were on was a penthouse, which had 2 floors 44 and 45. Hearing this, the latter replied in surprise that the owners must have been incredibly wealthy. While one was ringing the doorbell, Ryu Min was thinking to himself that there really must have been either someone from a rich family or a celebrity in such a place. To Ryu Won's surprise, no one answered his call, causing him to have thoughts that perhaps no one was home. Pressing once more, and getting no answer, he turned to his older brother who was standing by the wall and said a bit confusedly that it looked like no one was here. Turning around, they were about to head for the elevator, but the sound of the doors opening made them turn around. The person they saw in the next moment shocked one, while Ryu Min, although a little surprised, didn't change his face much. In front of them was a girl who had a beautiful appearance and was dressed in elegant clothes, who was looking at them with incomprehension. Her name was Seo Erin, and she was a famous actress.